Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rose Report. Tonight, I'm joined by Cynthia Cowie, the president of the San Diego Young Republicans. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to talk to you because California is a really hot button place right now. And I know that Republicans lost a lot in the last election. And in my mind, there hasn't really been a big discussion of what the future of California is, especially for young Republicans, for which there are many there. So just to start off, how did you get involved in Republican politics and become a leader within the young Republican world in California?
Great question. So first and foremost, I want to clear the record and then also just be very transparent, and hopefully my story can inspire and empower young Republicans because I have a very unique story. I'm not a lifelong Republican. I'm not someone that was always political. So I only got involved in Republican Party politics just 2 years ago. So after the 2020 election cycle. So that's when, after that, I got involved with the County Republican Party here in San Diego in January 2021. And for anyone that chooses to volunteer and get involved in the political atmosphere, especially if you are a Republican in California, it's a small world. So
Mhm.
once you get involved and you meet one person, it really sucks you in. And that's kind of like how I got my jump start. And so naturally, as someone that is in the demographic of the ages 18 to 40, I got involved with San Diego Young Republicans. And then after the election cycle, I got appointed to be the next president and chairwoman. And it's been so incredibly exciting. And I feel very blessed and privileged to be in this position.
And within California, I know it's a very small club, pretty much, within Republican politics in California. What have you seen as the main issue Republicans have been focusing on within the state? Because a lot of times we think every national issue is what every state is talking about, but that isn't always the case.
No, absolutely. And I'm glad you pointed that out because I think that the definition of Republicans, obviously, I think nationally, there is a huge soul. There's a lot of soul searching that the Republican Party needs to have nationally. And so unfortunately, that kind of environment and discussion always gets seeked down locally. And unfortunately, especially in San Diego, where there are specific issues and the California Republican, their priorities maybe look a little bit different in contrast to a Republican that's in a red state. Unfortunately, that discussion, that dialogue, and that discourse, it's not necessarily even being had. And if it is, their messaging and the branding, usually is lost in that transversion. So I would say the issues that San Diego Republicans in particular, and even California Republicans, if we want to expand upon that, is those kitchen table issues. So, for example, the homelessness crisis,
Right.
the high rising cost of living. So, the ability to be able to afford and buy your first home in California and San Diego, especially because the cost of living is expensive. It's one of the most expensive in the country. I would also add on there public safety, so the ability to feel safe where you live and the rise in crime. So I would say those kitchen table issues are the issues that California and San Diego young Republicans, I would even venture as far as to say even those in the middle who are politically homeless or independent, libertarian, and
Mhm.
also Democrats are issues that I hope the voters take heed on.
And what do you see as the main issue that brings over young people to the Republican side? Because, like you mentioned, you're not a lifelong Republican in that. So, what is the issue in your area that sort of starts the first thought process of maybe I'm a little more politically conservative or fiscally conservative than I thought I was originally for young people?
I think it can be different for a lot of people, but for myself, I think it was a lots of different seeds because I grew up in a family that didn't discuss politics at a young
Mhm.
age. So it was more of like my environment. So to be transparent, I went to UC San Diego, so the University of California, San Diego. People know it as UC San Diego or UCSD. And I was in college during the 2016 election. And
Mhm.
so I was forced to learn about it because of my environment and my association and all of my friends and my family. That was the thing that everyone talked about. It was the most exciting thing at the time for a lot of people. And so I think one way that can help bridge the gap for young Republicans and trying to win more young voters into the party is first starting with those kinds of conversations. To be honest, I wouldn't have voted in that election if it wasn't for a family friend that
Mhm.
taught me the education and showed me the importance of being civically involved. And so even as small as you striking up a conversation with your
Right.
loved one or someone that is ignorant and doesn't really know the importance of it, um, in my opinion, those people in particular are the easiest to persuade, especially because they haven't been exposed to the different ideas of the Democrat Party. And so they're a fresh sponge and they're a lot more receptive to those ideas. I will be honest, for me, I think people who are on the hard left, they're not pretty and movable. I think those are people that really have some set
Right.
cores of values where you can agree to disagree. But especially if the goal is to bring more young people into the party, there's a lot of fertile ground with those that are in the middle, that are no party preference, that are quite frankly sick with both sides of the political spectrum, that are looking for something different. And I think that the Republican Party has an area of opportunity to capture those people and winning those people over, focusing on the issues that really matter.
And that's an interesting point because a lot of times I feel like we focus so much on talking to the hard left. We go and we talk to young people who are super leftist or even older people, and we come up against this wall, and that's because they are hard left. They're not really movable in the grand scheme of politics. And in your area, what do you see young people who are movable? Like, what are their goals now? What are the goals of the young Republicans within your area? Is it to win another presidential election, to grow this coalition of people? Because I think nationwide, we're not really clear on our goals for the Republican Party right now.
I agree with you 100%. And I would even take a step further. There isn't really a set goal in regards to reaching
Yeah.
the youth demographic. I think that the biggest case study to be had was the Pennsylvania Senate
Yeah.
race with Dr. Oz and John Fetterman. I'm a huge believer in learning from the people that do better than me. And so the left
Yeah.
obviously won. And I think one forefront was the social media and influencer marketing campaign that they ran to show that John Fetterman was this. Now, obviously, we have our own opinions on how that race went and what went wrong or whatnot, but there is no denying that he won. There is a reason to be had, and there was a distinct difference with how that campaign was run. And there was a concentrated effort from the left to reach out to the youth, and that is to be applauded and something that I hope the right can replicate in our own shape or form. Mind you, I would take it a step further. I'm very critical. I think we are years behind, but
Mhm.
I'm all for starting right away and seeing what we can do to make up lost time. So, in particular, in San Diego, for the young Republicans, like I mentioned, we are a very unique demographic because we're in California. And I think the California Republican is a little bit different than the Republican that is nationwide or in a red
Mhm.
state. And so, for San Diego young Republicans in particular, we have a huge area of opportunity because we obviously have some solid registered Republicans, but we've had a few events this year, and I've been so incredibly humbled, and it's been so rewarding because we've actually had a lot of political conservative right-leaning people that have attended our mixers and our social
Mhm.
and political events so far this year, and they have never had any kind of interaction with our county party. They,
Wow.
haven't really been involved in the process where they've started volunteering. So they had heard about young Republicans organically. And I think because part of the reason is it can be intimidating to get involved in politics first and foremost, especially depending on your personality. I remember how hard it was trying to make new friends after I graduated from college and wanting to have like a certain core group of friends that aren't always my coworkers. So it can be a lot to try to branch. And then also, if you're our young conservative and you're right leaning, it adds a different layer to it because it can be hard to find people that politically agree with you. I mean, to be frank, I obviously have a lot of friends that aren't as political. I have a lot of friends that lean to the left. That's perfectly fine. I'm not the type of person to cut off people that disagree with me or have different kinds of beliefs in that sense. But I also don't think it is wrong to desire fellowship. It's not
Right.
wrong to desire having a community of people that believe and think like you. I mean, we do it all the time. We get involved in sports. We go to church. So it's very normal to desire that. And so that's one thing that I have noticed that's very unique for young Republicans in San Diego is just that desire to have that community of young people in the age range of 18 to 40 that believe and think like them. And I think, that's kind of one thing that's setting us apart from the left and in the young Democrats is I've noticed they've really focused heavily on political campaigns, which,
Mhm.
that's no other discussion on the direction of what young people should be focusing on. But I think that one thing that sets us apart is having that social community for the young Republicans that are in our county.
And that's an interesting point because I think a lot of times older conservatives sort of dismiss the idea of how hard it is as a young Republican, as a young conservative. I was in high school during the 2016 election and it was vicious. It was a vicious situation. I was in Massachusetts, a very liberal state, and I had teachers, trashing the whole process. And I had a system that really didn't allow for there to be a lot of diversity of thought. And I still spoke up and a few other people did, but when you're outnumbered 15-1, it is very intimidating. And that's a point that I think a lot of young Republican organizations aren't really honing in on, because to be a public young conservative, I think we have to redefine what public is. It can mean even just being publicly saying, I voted for this person on Twitter and having a completely different career. To do that is a massive risk right now and can lead to a lot of social isolation, which is why organizations like yours are so important, because it allows for fellowship, it allows for people to not go down sort of dark paths because they're just looking for some type of community. And I'm curious, what is the focus you think that within your organization that draws people in? Because I've seen it grow quite a bit. What is it that sets you apart, that allows for people to say, I can see myself in that organization? Because there are quite a few Republican groups throughout the country that are really struggling to be relatable enough to draw people in or have people be interested.
No, and thank you. And thank you for pointing that out because optics are important. So I'm glad, even though we're across the country, that social media wise, it is showing the buzz that San Diego Young Republicans is creating. And I can tell you, as someone that lives here and, obviously is extremely involved in the movement here, it's something that is not just for social media clout, it's something that's going on in real life. At all of our events that we have hosted so far, we have had multiple elected officials. We've had at least 10 different ones. And if you can imagine in San Diego, it's not like we're the majority here.
Right.
A lot of the times for our municipalities, we're in the super minority. In fact, for our last happy hour that we had in North County, San Diego, we had 8 elected officials. So we had 4 speakers and then all the other Republican electeds in the count in that like northern area of the county showed up to support us. And so I definitely wanted to point that out in that, not only is our organization building bridges within the young organization, it's something that is being noticed across, the people that are above us as far as generational gaps. But I think that what sets us apart and what I've noticed is what's drawn and created that buzz for San Diego Young Republicans. And what I would advise anyone that is working or volunteering in a young Republican organization is, and I can only speak of, for what's working for us and what I hope maybe young Republicans can model. Because San Diego is very unique in that, to take this step further for the presidential primary, you and me both know obviously how divisive it is. We don't like, obviously Trump is in the race and then DeSantis is set to announce this week. And then we obviously have a bunch of other Republican candidates that have announced and will probably continue to announce. And so in San Diego in particular, I am in a unique scenario because I have a lot of members that like Trump. I also have a lot of members that support DeSantis. And I also have a lot of young Republicans that like other candidates that are in the race, like Nikki Haley. And I also have a lot of, young Republican members that, they're very disenfranchised and they're very sick of the political process because of the vitriol that's been going on, especially when there's any kind of discourse when it comes to the presidential primary. And so I think, one thing that I decided to take the lead on is we are choosing to not endorse in that primary election in particular. And we actually will not be doing any kinds of endorsements for any of our local races here in San Diego. I recognize that there are pros and cons to that because, on one hand, you have the ability to kind of put your foot forward and have a say in regards to what Republican candidate can move past the primary, and then the goal is obviously for them to win the general election. But for me, at this point in time, and what I believe, in regards to the landscape for San Diego Young Republicans, I think taking that route is for the better, and it's worth any kind of cons that come along with it. And so that being said, if that is the platform, we're not necessarily taking a hard stance on who we believe as an apparatus should be the presidential nominee. And then that trickles down to all of our other races that we have here in San Diego locally, aside from the national side. I think that in itself has already made a very neutral environment where we are inclusive, in the sense that, like, if you are a solid social conservative Republican, San Diego Young Republicans is for you.
Right.
You're someone that is more center right and you have more libertarian views, San Diego Young Republicans is for you. And ultimately, our mission right now is to bring more young people into the party, because the county party, their role is essentially to register voters, fundraise, endorse, do get out to vote, and voter registration. And so for San Diego Young Republicans, what we're trying to ultimately do is to focus on the first step, which is we need to bring more people into party, but more in particular, we need to bring more young voters into the Republican Party. And so I think that's what sets us apart. I think that is what has made our organization really stand out among a lot of other young Republican organizations in the nation. That's what's worked for us. Might not work for everyone, but I stand very firm in what we're accomplishing.
I actually think that's a very good idea, because it is a very vitriolic political climate for Republicans and sort of within the party. And we've gotten to a Game of Thrones-esque world where it's like the only way for the Republican Party to be destroyed is for it to be destroyed by itself. And so a lot of people may criticize that action of, not endorsing people. But at this point, why would you? Why would you risk alienating so many people within your own organization? And to me, the national party, the sort of general apparatus, has not really earned our trust in a lot of ways with the last few elections. So I understand this idea of keeping with the values, keeping with the policies, and sort of separating yourself from the primary process, because only in recent years did young Republican groups become a major part of the primary process. It was not really that kind of thing. We endorsed, the major candidates once they had the nomination, but this idea that everyone must declare so early on, in my view, has really damaged our ability to have critical thinking and to really have debate. And it's not necessary. Democrats certainly aren't doing it. And the young Democrat groups that have, like the Democrat Socialists of America, it's hurt them significantly to come out so hard for certain candidates. And you mentioned having elected officials involved in your events. That's something I don't really see in a lot of groups. There's an effort to get a lot of big speakers, to get influencers. But when you come down to it, the events don't have the elected Congress people. They don't have the local people. So what role have those elected officials had in terms of helping you grow your organization outside of just coming? Are you going to them for advice? Is there a communication effort in San Diego with them?
So we are very blessed, because in the San Diego freedom and patriotic and conservative movement, it's been a hub of very significant influencers and change makers, aside from the electeds, although the electeds have been incredibly supportive. So to give some specific examples, Public Square, which is an app where you can find conservative, freedom-minded businesses, and this sprouted because of the COVID-19 pandemics, where there were businesses that, weren't necessarily, they were for masks or mandates or whatnot, but it's basically that app, Public Square, the founder and the CEO lives in San Diego. And then we also have a Reopen San Diego that fought aggressively towards the mandates. And so that's also based here in San Diego. We also have Let Them Breathe, which fought against mask mandates for children in grade school. That's also based here in San Diego. So I definitely want to share that, in San Diego, I acknowledge how incredibly blessed and privileged we are to have all these great conservative-minded individuals that all are in San Diego right now, but are also based in San Diego. But outside of that, outside of the grassroots support, we're very blessed to have a lot of institutional support. And I definitely want to give credit to the former president, who is now our chairman emeritus, Morgan Kimbaro, who also did a great job with cultivating these significant relationships with these stakeholders. And so obviously I want to make sure I do the same, expand upon those stakeholders' support and increase our institutional support. So I definitely don't want to take all that credit. It came from the leaders that came before me. But moving forward, outside of that, I think one thing that attributed to my success coming in was I also, was involved in politics before I became the president and chairwoman, obviously. And so those kinds of relationships, along with my new board members that are coming on, they also have their institutional support. And so I think part of what adds that institutional support for the organization is the makeup of our board, of all of our individuals and the relationships we have cultivated. And so naturally, if you're involved in things and you have good friends, they obviously want to support you. So, part of it is because of our mission, and then part of it is because of the makeup of the people that are in my leadership. But outside of that, even if like we didn't necessarily, have that, I would still feel confident that the San Diego elected officials would still be supportive of San Diego Young Republicans, because in part of that, in general, I think that there are some electeds that recognize that the youth is the future, essentially. And, one of our elected mayors that spoke at our last happy hour, she was sharing, personal stories about how she has a son and a daughter that are in their late 20s. And when she was trying to, educate her children, they were saying like, politics doesn't affect me. And she had to give them reality, like actually it does. Even if you don't want it to be, and if you don't like it, it impacts you. And those are the kinds of like reality conversations that, our electeds are not only witnessing like politically on their day-to-day job, they're also witnessing it within their own households. And I think these are relatable issues that we all, have come to grips with, and we've all had to figure out solutions for it. And so I think, in part of that, the reason why we have a lot of elected officials that support this is because they recognize the reality of it. And, in part of that, I think they have noticed the buzz that San Diego Young Republicans has created. It's that we're trying to fill in voids and gaps that, previous generations didn't necessarily provide solutions for. And so, because of the huge force and the buzz that we're creating, they recognize that. And it's something that only comes like once in a millennium, in my opinion. So that's why I feel, incredibly blessed with the kind of momentum we have created, and I have every intention to continue to bring it forward.
And it's interesting, you mentioned this sort of combination of grassroots and institutional support. A lot of times that is underestimated. There is an idea that you can do everything, with no institutional support, or everything with no grassroots support. And the Republican Party throughout the years has proven to be at its best when you have both of those things. And it's kind of a sad reality that in a lot of areas around the country, you don't have that. Whereas you look at Democrats, and even if they have purchased a lot of their grassroots support from companies or celebrities, they have that and the institutional support. So we are at a deficit when we limit ourselves and thinking we can't work with the major party, or we can't work with the grassroots, because the other side is and always will be. And I wanted to know, just sort of in closing, what is your advice to young Republicans this election cycle, gearing up for the 2024 election, who are worried about the state of the country, who are worried about what happens if, Democrats win again? What can they do to try to ensure not only like a presidential victory, but try to ensure some level of victory on their local levels for common sense ideas and policies?
Absolutely. So in closing, I would advise any young Republican, conservative, young person, or anyone that even is in the middle. My plea is also to yourself to also consider looking at the Republican Party as a platform as well for you to vote. My advice is to get involved. Like I said, depending on where you live in the country, I understand how incredibly intimidating it is. I know it firsthand. We both know it firsthand how incredibly hard it can be, but there is more of you than you believe. There are a lot of people that really do think like you, that are, and you never know, you could be that prayer that someone's asking for.
Right.
Someone is praying to find someone like you and a group of community like you that have conservative and Republican values. And so my advice is to get involved in the process, seek out these organizations, seek out your young Republican organizations. That way you can find people in your age range that think like you, make common friends. I mean, we've had a lot of success stories where people have met their best friends in young Republicans. I've even have heard of stories of people even meeting their future wife and their husband because they
Yeah.
happen to be at a young Republican event. And it's very common because, again, as I've reiterated before, it's very common and normal to desire fellowship and finding people that believe and think like you. And so that's just my advice. Start with the first step, get involved. And as far as the future of a country, we have gone through hard times before. I know that it's like, fear mongering to think like, everything's at stake. I will say, I think that there is a lot at stake. However, I believe if you get involved and you're part of the process, you're not going to be as doom and gloom about it. It's one thing to be fearful of the country. It's another thing to take initiative and be a part of it. I have found when I got involved in politics a couple years ago and I started to have a stake in it and I started to have a seat, really fight to have a seat at the table and, be involved in the process instead of complaining and instead of being fearful about the future of the country. I have found when I have taken that additional step to volunteer and to work in government and politics and figure out what I can do to be the change I wish to see in the community, that really took away most of my fears, and I was able to also play a role, even if it's small, to be able to move the country forward. My other last step is local politics is so much more important than national politics. I'm not, everyone should vote. Your congresswoman and man, they are important. So please vote. And I'm not disparaging anyone that isn't elected, but your local politics is so much more important. And if you find a really good young Republican organization, they should be able to have events where you can have access and meet your local elected officials. When I say local elected officials, I'm speaking about your county board of supervisors. I'm speaking about your mayors. I'm speaking about your council members. I'm speaking about your school board members. All those local races that are down ballot candidates. I recommend, getting to know them also. And when you know who represents you locally, that also makes this experience that we call politics a lot more exciting when they know your name, when you can say you know them, and you can also say that you played a role in, hopefully their reelection or also maintaining their records. That way, when they run for reelection, it'll be a lot easier. And so that's my recommendation. First, don't be afraid, speak out, find a young Republican organization in your area to get involved, stay active in local politics, and get involved in the political process.
And that's a really good point you made. When you get involved, the doom and gloom aspect of it can sort of dissipate because you see yourself in the process, and being in the process can get rid of some of the fear. I think for a lot of young Republicans and conservatives and young people in general, there's so much fear that any way they can sort of break it down is really beneficial for them right now in history. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people follow you on social media to keep up with your work?
You can find me on Twitter, on Instagram, and Facebook at Cynthia Cowie. So you spell my first name Cynthia. My last name is Cowie, Kaui. It's like Malibu with a K. So you can find me, Cynthia Cowie, on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
Perfect. And we'll link all that below. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about your organization.
Thank you so much for having me.